They say the West was born from fire and thunder, from the crack of a six-shooter and the silence that followed it. They say men carved it out of wilderness and God's blind mercy, that every inch of desert and dust was won by their grit, their courage, their law. That's what they say, but the truth is quieter. It moves through memory like smoke through old wood, because the West wasn't built by men alone. It was built by the forgotten hands no one wrote about, by the writers whose names turned to dust before history bothered to remember them. The wind remembers them still. It remembers the ones who carried both kindness and violence in the same breath, who could cradle a child and fire a colt in the same heartbeat. It remembers the women who crossed the plains, who buried the dead with one hand and held the gun with the other, who learned that mercy and survival don't always ride in the same saddle. They said no woman could survive the frontier, but some didn't just survive it, they owned it, if only for a moment, and that moment was enough to frighten the world. You won't find their names in the history book 6+S. You won't see their faces in the old photographs they show you in museums, because history wasn't written for them. It was written by the ones who wanted them to stay quiet. A woman who rode alone was a scandal. A woman who carried a gun was a threat. And a woman who could outdraw a man was something the West didn't have words for, so they erased her. They wrote her out of the stories, turned her life into rumor, and buried her truth beneath the weight of men's legends. They said she was a lover, a mistress, a thief, a widow, but never a warrior, never a legend. Still, she lived, she fought, she drew her gun and made her stand, and the desert took note. It doesn't matter that the history books forgot her name. The land remembers, the silence remembers, because for every Jesse James, there was a Bell Star. For every Wild Bill, a Calamity Jane. For every lawman who claimed to tame the West, there was a woman who faced the same gunfire and never flinched. Some called them sinners, some called them saints, but the truth is, they were something the West wasn't ready for, a kind of freedom that couldn't be fenced in. They weren't waiting to be saved. They weren't praying for a hero. They were too busy surviving, too busy proving that blood and dust don't care who you are, only whether you keep going when the sky turns against you. The Old West remembers its outlaws and its lawmen, but there were others, riders, whose names were buried under dust and time. Women who drew faster than most men dared to blink. Women who bled, who lost, who loved, and who kept the fire burning long after the storytellers stopped watching. And when history was written, they were written out, yet their echo lingers. In every creak of old wood, in every empty road stretching toward nowhere, their ghosts still ride, not for fame, not for vengeance, but for the truth that was stolen from them. Why did the frontier forget the women who fought, killed, and bled for it? Maybe it didn't forget them at all. Maybe it just couldn't stand to remember that the West was never just his story. It was hers too, and she was never the one who needed saving. They called it the frontier, a wild, boundless land, where men came to test themselves against the world. At least, that's what the stories said. The stories were always about men. They rode into towns with guns on their hips, and smoke in their hearts. They fought duels for pride. They built saloons, sheriff's offices, gallows, and history said the rest of the West followed behind them. But history lied, because the first ones to cross those endless miles of nothing were not just men. They were families. Wives who buried their children under skies that never rained. Daughters who held rifles taller than they were. Widows who took over ranches because there was no one else left alive to do it. The myth of the West, that shiny dream of honor, gunfire, and redemption, wasn't carved by the people who lived it. It was printed, written by men who never tasted the dust they described. Dime novelists sat in cities far from the edge of the world and turned blood and hunger into entertainment. They sold the West like a fable, and when they were done, only the men remained on the page. The women vanished between the margins, not because they were too few, but because they were too real, too complicated for a story built on glory and gun smoke. One old paper from 1877 once said, "Respectable women do not belong in the saddle." But the West was never built for the respectable. It belonged to the restless, to those who could not stay still, who carried both grace and fury in equal measure. Out there, where law ran thin, and the sky never ended, there were women who refused to wait for permission. They became scouts for the cavalry, sharp-eyed and steady-handed. They rode messenger routes through Indian territory, hauling letters through blizzards that killed grown men. They tamed horses no one else could break, and shot straighter than those who mocked them. Some became bounty hunters, tracking men others were too scared to face. Some ran ranches the size of kingdoms, while others ran whiskey and stolen cattle under the light of a dying moon. They did it all wearing borrowed names and borrowed freedoms, because the world they lived in had no room for truth. The preacher said a woman's place was in the home, but the home burned, and the prairie didn't ask who built it back. Men called them reckless, they called them wild, but in the silence between gunshots, it was often a woman's hand that steadied the horse, bandaged the wound, or finished what someone else was too afraid to start. Some of them broke laws, some of them made their own, and every one of them paid the price in loneliness, in whispers, in ink that never told their names. The frontier wasn't just a place, it was a test, and while the men were busy writing their legends, the women were out there living them. The myth of the West belonged to men who wanted to be remembered, but the real West, the cruel, beautiful, godless West, belonged to the ones who were never supposed to survive it. They did more than survive. They carved their stories into the bones of the earth, and even now, if you listen long enough, you can still hear them writing, not toward glory, not toward fame, but toward a freedom the world still doesn't have a name for. Because some women didn't wait for history to give them a place. They took it, and the cost was everything. They called her many things, most of them wrong. The kind of names that stuck to a woman like dust, rough, wild, reckless. But long before the stories turned her into something to laugh at, she was just a girl born into hunger and loss. The kind of loss that leaves you no choice but to become harder than the land itself. By the time most girls were learning to dance, she had learned to ride, shoot, and bury her dead. By 13 she'd seen more graves than sunsets. By 16 she'd left home behind, chasing work, chasing freedom, maybe just trying to find a place the world wouldn't spit her out. They said she drank too much. They said she swore like a man. They said she didn't know her place. But the truth is, she knew it too well, and that's what scared them. Those stories never made the papers. They didn't sell as well as the ones about whiskey and wildness. The world wanted a caricature, not a woman, because a woman could be admired or despised, but never both. She refused the parts they wrote for her. She dressed as she pleased, spoke her mind, lived without apology, and the more she refused to fit their story, the more they tried to rewrite her. There was someone she loved once, a soul just as lost, just as doomed. Whether they were bound by love or loneliness, no one ever really knew. When he was taken by a bullet, something in her broke that never found its way back. She drifted after that, town to town, smoke to silence, the kind of wandering that doesn't end until the body gives out. When she finally died, it wasn't in battle or glory. It was in a quiet place, far from the noise she'd lived through. No one sang for her, no one wrote the truth, but they buried her near the man she once rode beside, as if the earth itself remembered what the world forgot. Years later, they turned her into a spectacle, a myth for the stage, a punchline for the polite, but the real story never needed embellishment. She rode like the wind, cursed like thunder, and loved like no one dared to write about. She wasn't chasing fame, she was trying to survive, and when the West closed its eyes and tried to forget her, the dust remembered. Even now, if you stand still long enough, you can hear her name in the wind, a whisper the world wasn't ready to listen to. A woman who lived between truth and legend and never once asked for permission to exist. They called her a saint, but saints don't carry shotguns, and she carried two. They said she was too big, too loud, too black, too proud. Every word meant to remind her she wasn't supposed to belong. But the frontier wasn't made for belonging, it was made for surviving, and she did that better than most. She came west not chasing gold or glory, but something simpler, a chance to work to live on her own terms. She'd been born into change she didn't ask for, into a country that preached freedom and practiced the opposite, but she broke her own path. Step by step, wheel by wheel, until the road itself began to remember her name. They said she was built like a man, as if that explained her courage. But her strength didn't come from size, it came from years of doing what no one else would. Hauling freight through storms that swallowed sound, fixing wagons when the axles snapped, loading her gun before dawn because she knew what waited on the trails. Every mile of snow and silence tried to kill her. Every man who doubted her made her stronger. And still, she kept to her route, through snow deep enough to drown horses, through packs of wolves that learned too late what kind of fire they'd cornered. She never missed a delivery, not once. The mail had to go through, she said, and so it did. They said she cursed too much, drank too much, fought too much. They said she wasn't gentle, wasn't proper, but she was the one who fixed their fences, fed their children, and prayed for their dead when the preachers wouldn't leave the fire. She lived near a convent once, worked for the sisters, hauling supplies through mountain passes no wagon dared cross. When the nuns couldn't afford help, she did the work anyway. She'd come into town wearing men's clothes, not to be rebellious, but because dresses don't stop bullets or blizzards. The townsfolk called her wild, unladylike, dangerous. But when someone's wagon overturned in the pass, she was the first one there. When a child went missing in the storm, she was the one who rode out while others prayed. Her legend spread quietly, in whispers, not in print, because no one in power wanted to tell the story of a woman who broke their rules and still came out alive. A woman who was black, unbowed, and unafraid. She didn't fit into the pretty myths America liked to sell, so they left her out. They wrote books about cowboys and gunmen, about saviors and settlers, but they forgot the woman who carried the weight of their world on her shoulders, the one who kept the mail moving when men froze to death trying. She was a contradiction they couldn't explain, a fighter who prayed, a drinker who gave away her last dollar, a rough hand with a tender heart. They called her a saint with a shotgun because holiness was the only word they had left for someone that fierce. And yet, when she died, there were no monuments, no songs, just silence, and a grave buried under the snow she once conquered. But the earth remembers what the paper forgets. Every gust of wind that howls through the canyon still carries her echo. Every snowstorm that slams against the mountain still whispers her defiance. She was too much for her time, too brave, too loud, too alive. And maybe that's why history hit her, because the truth of her life made their myths look small. They said she was too rough to be a woman, but the frontier didn't care what she was, only if she could survive it. And she did, with a laugh that could shake the dust from the rafters, and a faith forged in fire, not words. So remember her, not as they wrote her, but as she was, a saint who carried a shotgun, a woman who carried a world, and a name the wind still refuses to let die. They called her a thief, a bandit, a scandal dressed in dust and rebellion, but she wasn't after gold. She was after something far rarer, a moment of control in a world that refused her any. They said she rode with a man once, quiet, clever, the kind who followed her lead. Together they stopped a stagecoach under the burning sun, guns drawn, hearts pounding, not for riches, not for fame, but for the small, impossible taste of power. The papers would later write it like a play, a lady bandit with a smile and a pistol. They made her sound charming, dangerous, beautiful, everything that sells, nothing that's true, because the truth wasn't charming. It was desperate. She'd been left behind too many times. She'd worked her fingers raw in boarding houses, kitchens, hotels, and still the world looked through her, like she was furniture. She wasn't robbing gold, she was robbing her story back. They say when she stopped that coach, she spoke gently to the passengers, promised not to harm them. She even handed one woman a coin back for the road home. Then she disappeared into the hills, her laughter lost in the wind, a sound caught between freedom and regret. The world couldn't decide what to do with her. Men called her wicked, women called her bold, and the newspapers, they turned her into something they could sell. They printed her face on every page, called her the bandit queen, and then tore her down for the same reasons they'd built her up. They loved her for being wild, and hated her for not apologizing. When they finally caught her, she stood in front of the judge and smiled. They said she told him, "You can't hang me, because I'm a woman." The crowd laughed, but there was a kind of truth in it, because even then, they didn't know how to punish someone who didn't play by their rules. She served her time, in walls built to break the spirit, but hers refused. When she was finally set free, she vanished, just rode off and never came back. Some said she changed her name, found a quiet life, and lived out her years as someone the world wouldn't recognize. Others said she went south, took up with traders, and kept wandering till the land swallowed her whole. No one knows for sure. And maybe that's the point. Maybe she didn't want to be found. Maybe the silence was her revenge, a story she kept for herself when the world tried to take everything else. Because for one brief, burning moment, she held the gun, she gave the orders, she owned the sky. And when the history books forgot her, the wind remembered. It still carries her laughter, sharp as broken glass, bright as defiance. They said she was a thief, but she wasn't stealing gold. She was stealing back a piece of freedom, a piece of herself, from a world that never once offered it. And maybe, in the end, that was the greatest heist of all. They called her the bandit queen, but every queen rules only until the men take back the throne. She wore black velvet when the world expected rags. She rode with a rifle across her lap, and silence on her tongue. And when they told her to kneel, she smiled, and didn't. They said she ran with dangerous men, men who rode fast, shot faster, and vanished into the night before their names cooled on a wanted poster. She knew them, rode beside them, sometimes led them, but they weren't her masters. They were her mirrors, each one searching for a piece of power, in a land that swallowed pride and spat bones. They called her thief, rustler, conspirator. They accused her of harboring men the law couldn't touch. And maybe she did. Maybe she gave shelter to those the world had already condemned, because she knew what it felt like to be hunted. The truth and the lies blurred around her like heat on the horizon. No one could tell where the woman ended and the legend began, and she made sure it stayed that way, because she understood something the others didn't. The West didn't reward truth, it rewarded stories. So she made herself one, dressed in black, rode with grace, and stared down sheriffs who couldn't decide whether to arrest her or tip their hats. The papers loved her, not for who she was, but for what she symbolized. They painted her as a temptress, a rebel, a devil in silk, but they never wrote about her hunger, her losses, the children she buried, the homes that burned because she refused to obey. She played their game because she had to, turned her myth into her armor, turned fear into survival. She learned that in a world built by men, power had to be stolen, and freedom came with a price tag written in blood. There are stories that say she ruled her own kind of court, judges made of whiskey bottles and moonlight, laws written in dust and gunpowder. Those who wronged her paid, those who rode with her swore loyalty until death, and death came for her too, not in a duel, not in glory, but in betrayal. She was found on a dirt road in the spring of 1889, shot in the back, the earth drinking her silence before the world could. No trial, no justice, just another woman written out of her own ending. The papers called it fate, but it wasn't fate. It was punishment, for living louder than they said she should, for wearing velvet instead of shame, for carving out a life that didn't ask permission. They buried her name beside the men she'd once ridden with, and for a while, people remembered. Then, as always, the silence crept back in, but there's a whisper that still drifts through the plains, that if you listen close, you can hear her laugh in the wind, sharp and proud, like the crack of a gun that refuses to fade. They called her the Bandit Queen, but she wasn't ruling over men, she was ruling over her own story. For a brief, wild moment, she made the frontier her kingdom, and her crown was carved from everything they tried to take. And when they finally stole her life, they still couldn't take that, because every queen falls, but not every queen is remembered by the wind. They called them the deadly daughters of the West, but death wasn't what made them dangerous. It was that they lived in ways the world said they shouldn't. There was one who rode with a man the world remembers better than her. She vanished like smoke after his fall. No grave, no trace, only rumors carried by riders who swore they saw her cross the border, free and unchained. They say she looked back once at the land that made her and broke her, and then never again. Her name faded, but her silence became legend. Then there was the one who turned precision into rebellion. A rifle in her hands became a voice, a way to speak when words weren't enough. Crowds came to see her shoot, but what they didn't see was how she fought. For women to be more than decoration, for a life that wasn't defined by a man's applause. They called her a performer, she was a reformer, and every bullet she sent flying was aimed at the cage they tried to build around her. And another, a young woman, with a face too soft for the wanted posters they printed. The only one among her kind, riding with men whose names bled into history books, while hers bled out in the margins. She was loyal, clever, relentless, and when the noose of time tightened, she slipped through it. The world forgot her, but the dust did not. These women, they weren't sisters by blood, but by defiance. They walked different trails, loved different men, broke different laws. Yet, all of them were hunted by the same truth that the West had no place for women who wouldn't kneel. The world called them outlaws, bandits, thieves, but they were something rarer, survivors. They carved themselves into history's blind spot, each one a whisper the historians tried to erase. And still, somehow, their echoes linger. You can feel them in the wind that crosses old trails, in the creak of abandoned saloons, in the stories that never made it to print. They were more than the men they followed, more than the legends they were buried beneath. They were proof that the West was not a man's kingdom. It was a woman's trial by fire. History wasn't written in ink. It was written in blood, in whiskey, and in silence. And if you listen close enough, you can still hear their names, half spoken, half forgotten, riding on the breath of the desert wind. It wasn't bullets that silenced them. It wasn't the gallows, or the deserts, or the years. It was the pen, the quiet stroke of ink on paper, that decided who was hero, and who was forgotten. The West was never empty, but the stories told about it were. The writers who came after the gun smoke cleared, they didn't want women who fought, or bled, or led. They wanted someone to serve the coffee, to wait by the window, to mourn the men who mattered. So they rewrote them, turned the fearless into footnotes, the gunfighters into mistresses, the riders into widows waiting for someone else's legend. The truth was never lost. It was edited. Newspapers called them wild, unchaste, unfit for the saddle. Men who killed were called desperados, but women who rode were fallen. The difference was ink, and who held the pen. Dime novelists painted them in corsets and heartbreak, their grit washed away by fantasy and fear. And when Hollywood came, it finished the burial. Cameras turned queens into sidekicks, turned defiance into flirtation, turned freedom into tragedy. The real women vanished behind the celluloid smile. It wasn't their guns that killed their stories. It was the typewriter, the quiet machine that could murder truth and call it storytelling. But history has a way of unearthing its own ghosts. Every archive opened, every photograph re-examined, every forgotten name rediscovered. It's a resurrection, a rebellion against the erasure that once felt permanent. Now, voices rise where silence once reigned. Writers, scholars, filmmakers. They're dusting off the lies and finding the women beneath. The true pioneers, the writers, the fighters, the dreamers. And every time one of their stories is told again, the West grows a little less lonely. For every word that erased them, another is being written now, not to glorify, but to remember, not to tame their legend, but to let it breathe. Because these women were not ghosts. They were flesh and blood, heart and hunger, steel and sorrow. They were history, and the pen that buried them will now be forced to dig them up. Time buries faces, but not fire. And the fire of those women still burns, low, steady, defiant, beneath the dust of the West they once ruled. Their names echo like half-remembered prayers. The rider who vanished into the border winds. The markswoman who turned her aim into a voice. The one who rode with the men and never bowed her head. The women who carved their freedom on horseback and paid the price in silence. They were legends before they were myths, and myths before they were erased. For a long time, it seemed they'd been swallowed whole by history, by pens that preferred to write about the men they outshot, outlasted, outlived. But truth has a way of coming home, and it's riding back now, in the words of women who refuse to let the trail end. There are historians digging through yellowed letters, unfolding the corners of forgotten lives. There are storytellers who look beyond the saloon doors and silver screens, finding the faces that never made the frame. And there are women, modern writers, reenactors, filmmakers, who saddle up not to pretend, but to remember. Each time a story is told true, the silence breaks a little more. Each time a name once buried is spoken aloud, the West grows wider again. The frontier never ended, it just changed its name. It lives in every woman who refuses to be written out, in every dream that dares to ride alone. And somewhere out there, beneath the same burning sun that once hardened their faces and hearts, their stories still ride, wild, unbroken, and finally free. The wind still carries their names, faint, but not gone. You've heard them tonight, rising through the silence that once tried to bury them. They were more than stories. They were storms that refused to pass. If these legends made you feel the dust of forgotten roads, if you heard their footsteps somewhere between the gun smoke and the truth, then ride with us again, because every shadow in the West has a story worth remembering, and some ghosts only rest when we speak their names aloud.